You know, some of the most beautiful and peaceful places in the world are cemeteries. This is mine. I don't mean I'm buried here. At least I don't think so. At least, not yet. But in 1975, I first came to this cemetery, and I've been visiting cemeteries all over the world. The names on these headstones around this cemetery are the names on the streets all over Long Beach. The founders of my city reside here. This is where the original Long Beachians live. I come to this cemetery a lot to think, to contemplate, and I wonder why people are afraid of the dead and cemeteries make them all creepy and creep them out. Let's be real. As humans, we have a preoccupation with what comes next. And writers, for years and years and years, have been fantasizing about it. Now, one of my favorites, someone whose books I have read in this very cemetery, maybe right here, by Miss May Davis, honey, Cyrilida May Davis, is Anne Rice. And I met her son many years ago, about 10 now, who, when he came out as a gay person. I first interviewed her in New Orleans, as they call it, New Orleans, with my late husband, Andrew Howard, on a trip going through there. And I've interviewed her many times throughout the year. Now, she writes about vampires and ghosts and goblins and, you know, mummies and things that come up and come out of the ground. Trust me, I've been here many a night. Nothing really has come out of the ground around here. Now, if you know Anne Rice and you know the Vampire Chronicles, which is not her new book, by the way, her new book is about Ramses and Cleopatra. Ramses, of course, another character she has created, the mummy. But the Vampire Chronicles, certainly Lestat and Louis, her favorites and my favorites, and I always vacillate on which one I would be. Would I be Lestat with his fabulous fashion sense that he has? Or would I be Louis with, you know, his brooding and his temperament? I never do know. One thing I do know is Anne Rice is a delight, her son is a joy, and we got to sit down with them in their West Hollywood apartment, in his West Hollywood apartment. Anne lives someplace else, but she was visiting for the book tour, and have tea in one of her favorite, and now my favorite, tea sets. In the year 2001, so this would be 16, 17 years ago, we were on the 10 freeway, my late husband and I, on our way to KFI Radio. And I said, do you know this freeway touches so many cities and states across the country? It goes from the Santa Monica Pier to Jacksonville, Florida. Wouldn't it be great to broadcast all across the way, never going more than 10 miles north or south of it? Well, we did. And what an adventure. Brandon and I are making a documentary out of that. We're going to do the trip again. But when we got to New Orleans, we opened up the phone book because I had heard that Anne Rice, my favorite author's phone number, was in the phone book. And I thought, no, this just cannot be true. It was true. And there were phone books, actually. There were in the Google or whatever. There were the white pages.
Yeah.
I opened it up. A wonderful person answered the phone. I said, I am a radio host. I am from Los Angeles. I have a major show that I'm traveling with. I would love to interview Miss Rice. The next day, the very next day, we arrive at her door, me carrying the only store-bought version of Queen of the Damned that I could get, which was a paperback. And you answer, Lestat, Louis, and Claudia dolls are right by the front door. I'll never forget it. We go in and do the interview. You were upstairs. You were 19 years old.
Who knows what I was sleeping
And I don't want to know what you were doing up there. No.
Out until 4
and
in the
all
morning.
this artwork around us is by your late husband, Stan. He was there painting. You gave us a grand tour. You showed us where Lasher was born, and you just all this wonderful stuff. And I just never forgot the generosity of spirit and sharing of the time, and meeting Anne Rice, which was pretty frickin' cool. So it's even more cool now to be sitting in her son's apartment in West Hollywood. Her openly gay son, by the way, which I think is pretty cool.
Very open.
Score one for our side.
He's
open. He's open.
The recruitment
always
effort works.
Yes.
I was successfully recruited. Yes.
Yes, we got the toaster oven. So it's a really great thing. It's sort of like a coming full circle, for me at least, in terms of interviews. I'm here because they have a new book that's out, and I really want to talk about that, so much so that I dressed for it. And I also want to talk about just life as the Rices these days. First of all, thank you all, and thank you for inviting me up to the house. It's very nice. They did a 6-hour Gab Fest yesterday, and we're the last thing they're doing, and we thank them for that. You know, I sent you the itinerary that we're going to talk about, but I want to jump around because I do want to start with the new book. On the way up here, I had a friend of mine try to Google how many mother-son writing teams there are. It was very hard to find a lot of resources on that. There's not a lot of mother-son or father-son. Stephen King just did one.
With his son.
With his
With
son,
son,
yeah.
Owen, yeah.
With Owen. But there's not a lot of collaborations with family. So you two are sort of unique in that. And I wanted to ask, because a lot of celebrity kids try to either run from their parents or run from their parents' job. You know, I don't want to be and yet you have not only embraced your mom in a really great way, because you two remind me of me and my mom before she passed. We were inseparable. But you've also now written with her.
Yeah.
Who asked who to collaborate? How did that, did you ask him, or did he say to you this would be a good idea? How did that happen?
I asked him.
You asked him.
I don't think Christopher would have ever come to me and said, "Can I collaborate with you on one of your series?"
Even if he
just-
wanted to?
No, he wouldn't have done that. But
Why wouldn't
I
you have
asked
done
him.
that?
Oh, I don't know. It's kind of presumptuous, you know, and I think it's
Propriety, well.
yeah, it's a little
Yeah.
presumptuous. I think also what we were looking at too is that my books are very different from hers.
Yeah.
So if it was going to be a combination, it needed to be the right formula for the right project. And this book, you know, really to answer the question of how we came to collaborate, working together on various Hollywood projects, specifically adaptations of her books, is how this became to seem less like an extraordinary or out of the pale thing to do.
It's sort of like and it's the Vampire Chronicles. Are we allowed to
Yeah,
say
yeah,
that?
yeah,
It's the
absolutely, yeah.
Vampire Chronicles. They're being made for television finally.
Right.
I hope that you'll be happy with them. I had interviewed you
She's
right
an
after
executive producer,
Okay,
so she
great.
better be
Yes,
happy.
you know.
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
I'm an executive producer. Chris is an executive producer, and he's writing the scripts.
Yeah.
So we are collaborating on that insofar as I read the
You've
scripts.
trusted your other children to your child.
I
Yeah,
have.
absolutely.
I
But I
have,
mean, even
yeah.
before that, we were working on a movie version that didn't work out. Thank God, because it wasn't ultimately what we wanted to do with the project. But
Right.
we were working to make it the best Anne Rice adaptation that it could be. So it paved the way for us to work together on a book, because I
Yeah.
think the stakes are higher for Hollywood adaptations in collaboration, because there's so many other people you have to collaborate with.
Right.
Whereas with a book, it's the editor, really.
And talk about high stakes. In reading about this new book coming out, the fans were clamoring. They wanted more of Ramses. And 89, I believe, is when I read that book, or was it? It was 89.
89, yeah.
89 when I read that. I still don't understand the whole beef with Cleopatra. We'll get into that. But
if you read the sequel,
yeah, that's
you'll-
right.
you'll
I got
understand,
to
yeah.
get to the sequel. Get my
Yeah.
hands on that sequel. What took? Was it just life, or was it not his time?
A number of things happened. I mean, there was a lot of commotion at that time. My father died at that time, right at the time when Ramses was on the bestseller list. And I was working on the Vampire Chronicles. The Queen of the Damned was my first New York Times #1 bestseller, and that changed our lives. Just really.
Queen
you
of the
know,
Damned was the first one of the Chronicles to be #1 bestseller.
It was. It was. And that was an amazing experience.
It's an amazing book.
And within a few years, the movie was made.
Interview with the Vampire.
You know,
that was
and that
93 or
made
94.
that. I always have to take some time out after a movie. I have to absorb that, you know. So all of those different things happened. James Cameron had bought the rights, really, you know, through a studio to the first Ramses book, and he was going to make a movie out of it. We'd talked on the phone. I'd met him. He's a charming guy. But then he made the Titanic, and the Titanic was a huge success, and it just wasn't in the cards to
Right.
come back to this project. So all of those things kind of.
It's all very
Yeah.
Yeah.
for us, because we're here. This is typical Hollywood. This is how projects
Yeah,
get
yeah.
shuffled and then get made.
Sure.
Took Streisand 30 years to make Yentl, to have things fall into place to where she could actually get to it.
That's really it. I mean, I was free to write it in any
Right.
time. I always keep the literary rights on anything, but all that was going on in my mind. And then I reread the book, and I found I wanted to do something new, so I did the Wolf Gift books.
Right.
But I thought maybe if I invite Christopher in on this and he wants to do it, maybe he'll have fresh ideas about this, and he'll certainly bring fresh energy, and we can do something with it.
When she called and said, let's do this with the Mummy, with that particular book with Ramses, what did you think?
I thought it was very exciting, but I thought it was a tremendous responsibility because the book does
I'd be
have
scared
such
to
devoted
death.
fans. It does.
Yeah.
And it's like nobody wanted me to muscle in and make 50% of it a Christopher Rice novel, because up until that point, Christopher Rice novels had been mostly contemporary, gritty crime thrillers with a lot of gay characters and some political themes in them, but nothing historical, nothing period, unless you're counting one flashback scene to the 60s, historical, you know, which, so there was nothing like invoking Edwardian atmosphere and detail and all that sort of stuff.
And fans get
But
very possessive.
those are all reasons why I wouldn't do it alone. To do it in collaboration with Mom, that makes sense.
As a writer, I'm curious how it worked, and then we'll move on from it, but I really am curious because I used to co-write with a writer, but really what I did is I wrote it, and then I gave it to her, and she added some flavor, and then I changed it a little bit more, and then we turned it in. But that was our process. That's how we did it. What was your process? How did you two merge together to write it?
Well, we sat down together at a table much like this one with a lot of caffeine and some cats on the periphery and some relatives.
Sketch
and the
pad
sketch pad.
I always
Mom
mention
thinks the
it.
sketch. She loves
Well, I
the sketch
love
pad
that,
and the
and
felt tip
yeah.
detail because I think it's
I make
so
a map that I
tactile.
can see in the in
Yeah.
the sketch pad, and I need that. I see
is.
music. I
Right.
see
It's like a mind
books,
map,
And, you
yeah.
know, they're like mountain ranges to me.
When I
and-
do shows, I have computers, iPads, everything. I need a piece of paper. I need to write out my segments. I
Yeah.
need to
Yeah,
write out
sure.
teasers.
Because
I have
it's
to, part of my process.
the act of writing it out is also part of the
Yeah,
process.
you
It's how
internalize
it-
that. You
it
often don't
connects
even
up
go
here.
back to the map. You've
Right.
Right.
got it in your head.
So, but that was the first part of the answer. So we had that big intensive meeting, and then she had the faith in me to go off and write a complete draft on my
Yeah,
own.
we had hammered
which
out
I
the
then,
story, what was going to happen.
the plot, the
Yeah.
beats, the outline, and then she pulled that draft apart. We sat down again, and then I went off and wrote a second draft, and she did the final pass. And I think the final pass was key because that was the last opportunity we had to make sure this was truly a book that continued on the themes and the promises of the first one.
Yeah.
And I think it does.
It's almost like you were a chef and you were the head cook.
Kind of.
And you assembled the
Yeah.
ingredients and got the base going.
Yeah.
And then came in with the seasonings and the
Right.
flavorings and the things that make the dish the dish.
Yeah.
That's really quite cool. I want to ask you. You tell the story. In fact, it was read to me last night. You have a lot of fans. Both of you do. And when I
grateful
said
for
I'm going
that
up to the
every day.
Rices to interview them, people were fainting. I think it was about you. People faint around me. But just have Karel.
Karel's
it's just,
here.
He's here.
Yeah.
But you were quoted about being a fish out of water in New Orleans when you got there from San Francisco.
Yes.
That's one of the quotes in the media. You know, here I was, suddenly a polo shirt, wearing whatever in the middle of New Orleans. When I visited you, you were very entrenched in New Orleans. And you even
was.
owned the convent at the time as well.
I did.
Yeah.
The whole block.
The whole block.
City block.
What was it that made you come to the West Coast?
Well, two things. Christopher moved back out to the West Coast. He'd been born in Northern California, and it was really his home, California. He was much more Californian than a Southern boy. He moved back out, and my husband died. And I was alone in that
Yeah.
vast house. There was no son, coming in and out with his friends. There was no husband. He was gone. And I realized I wanted to be out near Christopher. I really did. And also, I've spent many, many years of my life in California.
Right.
I lived in Northern California for years.
Right.
And at this point, I've lived in California longer than I ever lived in
Anywhere
Louisiana.
else.
Yeah, it's really
And yet you'll
really a
forever
second
be
home.
identified.
Well, sure, and it's my home. It's influenced, New Orleans has influenced all of my writing. But I came to California for the first time at 4 years old on a train with my mom. We stayed in Echo Park area, visited our aunt. I remember LA really well. I remember the places we went, the things we did. So it was natural to come back out here. Now, if he'd moved to Bangladesh, I might have had second thoughts.
Let's talk two things I love to talk at parties: sex and politics and religion. Because these are themes of your books.
Sure.
One of the Wikipedia things they say about the original Ramses, it was interesting to me. They talked about sexual fluidity. The sexual fluidity of Rice's characters are continued in this book. because of course they see Lestat and Louis as sexually fluid, and so I guess they saw some of the characters in Ramses as sexually fluid. Sexual fluidity is a big topic nowadays, and non-binary gender and all this kind of stuff. Yes. You have written your characters, even characters back in the day, right. I don't want to say it's sexually ambiguous, but they sort of follow their hearts and their passions, and if they're wherever their passions lead. Right. So how do your characters fit into this sexual fluidity conversation that's going on?
I have real trouble remembering that I have a gender. I have never felt comfortable being talked about as a woman or identified as a female. I just...
Me neither. But it happens.
Yeah.
But
Miss your beard. I'm Croatia.
But it's something I've never been comfortable with. And when I started to write, I didn't even think about it. I didn't even think about gay overtones to Louis and Lestat. I simply wrote about them in the way that seemed natural to me. And I remember a brilliant man, Richard Silbert, who was the head of Paramount at that time, briefly the head of Paramount. He was actually a famous, working on the crafted movies. He was a set designer, a brilliant set designer. But anyway, he said to me, it's polymorphous sexuality. They love Claudia, they love everybody whom they drink blood from and so forth. It's polymorphous sexuality. And I guess it was just completely natural to me.
Which it comes across in the writing. It doesn't come across as contrived. It comes as the characters would do this. It just seems like the characters. Let's talk religion. You had a small falling out with the Catholics. At least it was written about. Yeah. And nowadays, where are you with your I don't want to say your faith, but with your spirituality versus, we could all bash the Catholic Church. I always tell people big child rape ring, I don't really pay attention to it. Mm-hmm. And I don't. I think anyone that's a member of it is a member of the largest child rape ring in the world. And I'm very vocal about that. I'm sorry if it offends anybody, but to me, that's just what it is.
I can understand.
And yet my mom was a devout Catholic, and I buried her in the church, and I was respectful to the church and everything because that's what you do, But where are you now with that in that evolutionary process?
Well, to sum it up briefly, I went back to the church in 1998. I experienced a great desire to go back to God, to go back to the banquet table, to go back to the church that believed in the real presence on the altar and in communion. And for 12 long years, I lived as a Catholic, studied as a Catholic, went to church every Sunday, lived and breathed as a Catholic. And what the intense study of the Bible led me to was a total collapse of faith. In my view, the Bible simply does not support the Christian belief system, whether it's Catholic or Protestant or Episcopal or whatever. The idea of the need for a Savior is simply not supported by the Bible.
Right.
It's not in the Old Testament, and really isn't in the New Testament either. Right. And I felt very uncomfortable. And then as the Catholic Church got a very high profile against gays, behaving very badly about the revelations of child abuse, and really, in a sense, it had a very bad public profile that I couldn't exist with, and I frankly felt that way about all of it, the whole system. So I quit Christianity publicly. I said, I'm in bed with the devil, and I'm getting out.
I'm an atheist, but I'm not. I know there's wonder and marvel out there. I just don't even worry about it because I figure I'll get to it when I get to it. And if you live a good life as a good person, then that's all you can do.
See, that's not what Christianity really teaches.
At
this point, they're
very vengeful.
No, they're down to the idea that faith in Jesus is what saves, and that basically living a good life isn't the point. Well, see, for me, it is the point.
Right.
And I have a lot of feelings about how that theological idea permeates and poisons a great deal of their positions and theologies. And a lot of people who, of course, are good Christians and well-behaved people don't know that. They don't go that far with the theology. That's fine for them. When I went back, I thought theology didn't matter. God knew, I don't have to know. When I quit, I felt it mattered very much.
I think it does matter very much, actually. How fun was it to write Cleopatra?
Oh, it was a lot of fun.
Come on.
Well, here's what's interesting about
It's Cleopatra.
That. Well, it's interesting because when we sat down to have our first creative meeting about the book, I was insistent. The first book ends with a big cliffhanger.
Yes.
We know that Cleopatra was...
She survived... I'm sorry, spoiler alert for the first
Spoiler
book.
alert for the
She
book.
survives the horrible inferno that no one could survive.
Right, and she
Except an immortal.
Drunk the elect.
But the hallmark of her character in that book and in the sequel is that she was brought back from death against her will and and without her consent. And thousands of years before, when Ramses was her immortal counselor and offered her the elixir,
She said no.
She said no.
Yeah.
I want to die as a queen. So she's not
As
happy.
we all do.
Right, as we all do. And she's not happy to have been brought back from death against her will. So the question of whether or not she's actually even really Cleopatra, if the soul of the real Cleopatra exists in her, her form, her physical form, that hangs over the first book very much, and it hangs over this book. But I went into that first meeting insisting that she was going to be the monster of this book, that she was going to be a pure villainess.
Well, Ramses does seem to be a likable guy,
Yeah.
mummy, a dead person. You know?
Well,
A
Mom,
wonderful mummy.
he does seem to be a wonderful mummy.
and Mom was insistent, said, look, there's complexity to this character, there's richness to this character that you're going to miss if we take this approach. But she said, I'll let you try it. And I went off in that first draft and I tried it, and I was wrong. I was dead wrong. She was right. And I started writing when it needed to be right away. And I got into her character, and I got into the idea that the physical construct we'd set up in the mythology of the book of her not knowing if she was the real Cleopatra also kind of dovetailed with the scholarship about her, because her history has been written by her defeaters, if you will. The Romans wrote her story.
They maligned her as
And
a
maligned
whore.
Well,
her.
I heard
They
a
called
great,
her the
I heard
harlot
a
queen. And,
great
yeah.
quote in a movie that everything we know about the Vikings was written by Christians who hated them.
Sure.
Yes,
because they didn't
absolutely.
keep written
Absolutely.
records.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
everything we know about them is completely wrong.
Right,
you know?
totally. And there are contemporary scholars like Stacy Schiff and you know, other books that have been written about Cleopatra that are informed by this modern sensibility.
Did you
that
do
we
a lot
can't
of
trust.
research about the real Cleopatra when you were writing this?
Yes, I did some, because it's interesting. There are some things out there that were not true, that were invented by novelists and writers
Right.
and other things, and we didn't necessarily want to use those. But I think, look, we're not making a historical point that Cleopatra and Ramses are immortals who have lived for
it's not
thousands
an
of years.
historical
It's
novel.
it's not a piece of historical
Right.
fiction. It's this sort of
Don't tell Trump.
globe-trotting, yeah.
He'll believe everyone.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny because I think about your villains, and they're never really villains.
Oh no, I don't really do.
They have-
yeah,
they
villains. I
have-
just don't.
I mean, even Akasha, when she's on her
Sure.
killing spree,
Right.
she, in her mind, has a logic for what she's doing and why she's doing it.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And you know, Marius, all of them, when they go do some of them do some pretty terrible things, but when they do them, a lot of times it's not maleficent, it's not evil. It's
No.
they're seeing it as something that must be done.
Yeah, but I think
and-
that's good writing.
Yeah,
I don't think
and-
any villain thinks they're the villain.
Right.
you
So
know?
Cleopatra, I
Right.
would think, you know, in this new book, she wakes up pissed. She almost gets burned. Now she's really
Yeah,
pissed.
now
you
she's
know,
really pissed.
And Ramses better beware.
But, let me say something about Christopher's relationship with Cleopatra. I think Chris
'Cause you have one.
Chris has described it eloquently, but what I saw when I was reading that draft was that he had fallen in love with that character.
did.
Well, you have to,
And
right?
the writing, all the prose surrounding Cleopatra really was perfect.
Do
There
you
was
fall in
no
love with a
need-
character when you're writing?
yeah, all the time,
All of
but-
them, or just one or two?
More in love with some, less in
Who
love
do
with
you
others.
more love?
Oh, I love the Vampire Lestat with my whole soul.
You like him because he's a terrible infant. You love him. You love that
brat.
about him.
No,
He's a
I
brat.
love him because he's really what I would like to be. In
Oh,
every
see, Louis
respect.
is who I would like to be.
I was Louis.
Or Marius. Okay, Louis is a little whiny, okay. But Marius, you know, with the, well, I'd like to be Armand, but who doesn't want to be 16 and Greek? You know what I mean? You know?
But Marius has a ruthless side.
Oh,
He
yeah,
thinks
but he had to.
nothing
He
of
was the
just-
keeper of those who must not
Yeah,
be
I
named,
mean,
so.
he thinks nothing of burning to a cinder somebody.
I thought about being one of the redheaded twins, but just because they were redheaded twins, and that would be fun. I can't wait for everything you're working on. I am your client, both of you.
Right.
I am your consumer. I will be in front of the Vampire Chronicles weekly. I will be there. I can't wait to get a hold of the new book and read it. I've read all the others. I just finished Atlantis. I was a little slow on Atlantis. I like, but I got to it. And I read the original back in '89, so I've already read the first book of this sequence. So I cannot wait to get to it. The Vampire Chronicles had a long life.
Has a long life.
Is still living.
Right.
They are immortal.
Yes, they are.
Is Ramsay on the track now to become another immortal?
Another immortal
Well, you know,
series?
another, you know, like 4,
Yeah.
5, 6, 7 books.
Oh yeah, I think that could happen. I think that, when I reach the point that I can't write them any longer, I think Christopher could write the Ramses books and continue them if he wants to do it.
Do you know if my mother were a famous writer and she just said I could pass the mantle to my son, I would be jumping up and down and screaming. And
She said it a while ago, so
Oh.
I jumped up and down then. Yeah.
We want to do the third book. we've got a plot. We want to take it right into the war, you know, and we want to use the war responsibly, which I think you should do in a fantasy novel.
I agree.
Yeah, what does it
people-
mean for immortals to have to look at war and see all
Yeah.
that death and not be able to really do
and have
anything?
to see a whole
And
civilization
have it see it
destroying
repeat. Because
itself.
one thing I've learned, I'm only 55, but I have learned now that I've been in entertainment and talk radio and everything,
Mm-hmm.
I basically do the same show now I did 25 years ago.
Right.
It's the same topics. It's just different people. It's
Right.
just, you know,
Yeah.
the headlines change, but they
Right.
don't.
Right. Yeah.
You know, and so if you were an immortal, you would know that. You would know that there's cycles of human nature, and you would know which
Right.
one they're in their war cycle now. Then they'll come their peace, and then their renaissance. Then they'll destroy everything. Then they'll, you know, and you would
Yeah.
know that. And I wonder if you would get weary of viewing them. Do you think before I let you both go, now you've written Immortals too, do they pity us? Do they envy us? Do
No.
they...
The longer they're immortal, the more they fall in love with us. But the longer you're with someone, the more you can see their beauty.
And
I
you-
think that's
they-
what I got out of the Vampire Chronicles.
Yeah, they
eventually.
They appreciate us.
Yeah.
They appreciate us and they respect us.
How many times have either of you been asked, would you become immortal?
Many, many times, countless times. Of course I would. Anything. Well, I wouldn't say anything, but
I'm determined I'm going to be a downloaded intelligence, that they'll download me to a computer and to like the San Junipero on Netflix. They'll upload me to the cloud, and I'm hoping it's a Mac and not a PC so I don't crash. That's what I'm hoping.
Yeah.
We're going to continue. I could talk for an hour and a half to these two. I've loved talking to Anne over the years, that she's come on my show. Like I counted last night, she's been on my show 12 times, every time around a book. Or something that was going on, and it's always a delight and a joy to speak with her. Chris has become a friend. We're both local. His Instagram's hysterical. You're so supportive of authors. No, he I know you know this, but you really are. And you show up at the book events, and you both treat books like they're still golden little marvels. And
sure.
the respect for the written word and the respect for other, you both promote other novelists and other people that you are excited about.
Right.
That's important today when the
Sure.
arts are very frowned upon, and reading more than 128 characters is not really what people do. So
Yeah.
I know they're going to enjoy the book. We're all going to enjoy the movies. I don't know whose house we're going to meet again in 17 years, but wherever it is, I hope we'll be having a good time. Thank you.
17 years.
Yeah, well, hey, you know what? It could happen.
It's
It could
gonna
happen. We just talked about being immortal.
It's gonna
It could happen.
Yeah, well, I'm surprised to be alive at all, actually.
Oh, so am I. I lived, there was the 80s, the 70s, the 90s, Lord. I'm glad you are, and I'm glad you're still writing, and I'm glad you're writing with your son, Chris. It's an exciting collaboration.
Thank you. It's very exciting for
I am
us.
Karel. I'm going to continue to be the luckiest guy in Los Angeles today as I sit having coffee, well, I'm having tea, with two of the most prolific and important writers in America today. And that's not an overstatement just because I'm here with them. Look it up. They are. Read a book. It's actually good for you. You can read it on your iPad if you want to, but read a book. Read theirs. They're really good.
Something gets out.